to welcome you all to today's event, which is the third program in the ongoing Baxter Liberty Initiative. We have a very special treat in store for us today. I remember sitting in a graduate seminar at the University of Chicago the morning in 1992 when the Swedish Royal Academy recognized the groundbreaking work of Gary Becker, and all of us in that seminar felt as though the tectonic plates of social science research had just moved beneath our feet. And 20 years hence, I think those plates are still shifting, and we will all soon get a sense of some of the spellbinding force of Professor Becker's ideas. The fact that Professor Becker's lecture is the third in the Baxter Initiative is significant on this campus. I think on this campus, if something happens once, it's sort of a lark, an intellectual dalliance. If you do something 3 times with a bright future for more to come, then we have built the foundation for an institution and maybe even a movement on this sometimes seemingly immovable campus. So the Baxter Initiative, which you'll hear more about, is a vital program in the department, and we would not be at this moment but for the generosity and vision of Ambassador Frank Baxter, who will be more formally introduced in a moment. The initiative is vital because of its core dedication to the ideals of freedom in political and economic life and thought, which is a set of ideals that's fully consonant with the mission of the Department of Political Science here at Berkeley. In fact, Berkeley Political Science would not be what it is, which is the largest major on this college and one of the leading political science departments anywhere in the world, but for its commitment to the core principles of free and critical exchange of ideas through venues like this one here today. That's how we train world-class scholars. That's how we cultivate better citizens, and that's how we cultivate the future leaders in our communities. And for this reason, I could not be more thrilled that the department is home to the Baxter Initiative, and I'm very excited to see the new and impactful ways that it promises to shine as a bright beacon on our campus. Let me now turn to the introduction of a colleague and distinguished member of our department, Professor Jack Citrin. Jack is Heller Professor of Political Science and serves as Director of the Institute of Governmental Studies here at Berkeley. And together with a committee of other faculty on campus, Jack has led the creative team shaping the Baxter Liberty Initiative at Berkeley, and he will lead us through this afternoon's program. And so on that note, I'm delightful to hand out these ceremonies to Professor Jack Citrin.
Political science is a bigger major than economics?
No, not now. Economics is number 1.
Thank you, Teku, and welcome everyone. It's been a real privilege for me to be involved in this initiative along with Professor Hollinger and Professor Cooter and Professor Hoekstra under the guidance of Dean Hesse, who's sitting here in the first row. Before I get to the formal introductions, let me recognize important campus officials who are in the audience. I see Executive Vice Chancellor George Breslau there, Vice Chancellor of Business Administration, John Wilton, the Dean of Bowman School, sitting in the front row, Henry Brady, and I believe Governor Granholm, who has been gracing the Berkeley campus and teaching here last year, is also in the audience. Probably I'm missing others. I also want to welcome here Professor Gidi Nashat Becker, Gary Becker's wife, who is herself a distinguished scholar, a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, a professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern history at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's an economic historian who's written prolifically about Middle Eastern history and women in the Middle East today, and she and Gary have co-authored a book together, so that's another achievement in a marriage, I suspect. Anyway, it is a pleasure to welcome everyone here, and we want to move quickly to Professor Becker's address, but before that, I want to say a little more about Frank Baxter and ask Frank to say a couple of words himself. Frank Baxter graduated from UC Berkeley with a BA degree in economics with honors in 1961, but before college he had served in the Air Force for 4 years. From 1974 until 2002, he was employed by Jefferies and Company, a global investment bank, where in 1987 he became CEO of the company, and he retired in 2001 and now serves as chairman emeritus of the firm. From 2006 to 2009, he was the ambassador to the Oriental Republic of Uruguay, and his civic activities now are many and varied. He is truly committed to youth, education, and the arts, dedicating time and energy on many boards. He is a trustee of the University of California, Berkeley Foundation, and has demonstrated through many, many years his deep commitment to the university. He currently is the vice chair of the board and chair of the executive committee, a truly important position. On a personal note, he's been married to his wife, Kathy, for 44 years, and I know that that was a very good decision because she was a high school classmate of mine all those years ago. So you beat us to it, Frank. And so on that note, let me invite Ambassador Baxter to come up and say a few words.
Thanks, Jack. Those stairs are tough. I just did the LA Marathon on Sunday. I was the number one in my age class, but I haven't asked how many people were in my age class.
That's pretty good.
And one little correction, Jack, we've been married for almost 51 years. But I'm still on trial, I can tell you that. And my wife, Kathy, apologizes for not being here. I am so grateful to the citizens of California and to this university for the impact that it's had on my life. I was the oldest of 6 in a very poor family, a good family, but a very poor family. And because of what Cal is all about, I got an education that enabled me to be part of the American dream, which is, unfortunately, there are so many millions of children throughout our country today who will not have that opportunity. So I'm very, very grateful for it. And I'd like to say to the students here that having a Cal degree is a tremendous chip in whatever you embark on, that it's a great edge to get you in virtually every door. So be grateful for it. And things have evolved. Now the citizens of our state have delegated, the leaders that we've chosen have decided that prison guards and pension funds, et cetera, are more important than public education. So we, as members of the Cal community, have to work harder, be more philanthropic, have to learn from our Ivy League peers, or not quite peers, but close to peers, how to support our university. And I think it really begins in our freshman year. So and there's nothing like serving. One of the things that took me a long time to learn, that when someone said that mature ambition is not knowing what you want and how you get it, but knowing what you have and how to give it. And that, when I realized that, it just changed my life in terms of my work and the things I do away from work. I have been very proud of our university in its commitment to diversity. But to me, it seemed as though one little aspect of diversity wasn't here, and that was in the political economic sphere, and that was the intellectual diversity. That it seemed like market liberals, classic liberals in the tradition of Adam Smith and going further on in Milton Friedman and Hayek, Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, were really an endangered species on our campus and most campuses. And I mentioned that to Dean Hess, and she said she didn't agree with me, but said, if you want to do something about it, why don't you bring some of the more brilliant people in that field to come and share the ideas with our wonderful, wonderful constituency, and that even if nobody agrees with them, that you're better at with your own ideas if you really know what the other people are saying. And so we have done that. And I think you'll notice this from Professor Becker and the last two people, that since they kind of feel generally that an organic development of the political economy with not too much micromanaging from powerful forces, government, unions, corporations, or in our country, sort of a coalition of those three that are citizens, and focusing on things where government focuses on things like protection and defense, that it results in more people that are happier, that are safer, that are more productive. And also, you'll probably notice from Professor Becker and the other two people who were here, is that they're a little bit jollier, because they do not have to save the world. I mean, they can tell people how it's done, but they always say that worry is the price of playing God. And so if you're having to worry about how to allocate, reallocate all those things, it's a very worrisome affair. So I'm happy to have a really very jolly fighter for liberalism and freedom speaking to us. Thank you.
Well, let me start by explaining how we're going to proceed. I'm going to introduce Professor Becker, and he's going to give an address, after which he's going to take a seat on the stage, and Professor Moretti will be introduced by me, and he's going to comment, respond to Professor Becker's remarks. Then, after Professor Becker says a few words in response to the response, we're going to collect the cards that have been distributed, and that will be there'll be an extended Q&A period. I will parse those questions, try to have a diverse set of questions, ask them, and then both Professors Becker and Moretti will comment and respond to the audience, following which there'll be a nice reception in the atrium. But let me begin with the most important thing, and that is to introduce Professor Gary Becker, who for many probably doesn't need much of an introduction because he really is a legend in the economic profession. To give some of his background, he received his BA degree from Princeton University and then his master's and Ph.D. in economics from the University of Chicago. He taught at Columbia University for 12 years before returning to the University of Chicago in 1968. He has honorary degrees from a large number of universities. I'm going to mention Harvard, Princeton, Colombia, Hitotsubashi University in Japan, University of Aix, University of Marseille in France. He is now University Professor of Economics and Sociology at the University of Chicago and a professor at the Chicago Booth School of Business. He is also the Rosemary and Jack R. Anderson Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. It's already been mentioned by Professor Lee that Gary Becker won the Nobel Memorial Prize for Economic Sciences in 1992. He's also the winner of the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2007, the National Medal of Science in 2000, the John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economic Association in 1967, earlier in his career, and numerous other awards. He is recognized for his expertise in human capital, economic incentives, economics of the family, and economic analysis of crime, discrimination, and population. So, from a huge, huge portfolio. For almost 20 years, he was a featured monthly columnist for Business Week magazine, and he and Judge Richard Posner have a fantastic blog right now, becker-posner.blog.com, where every week they debate a different public policy issue in a very animated way, I should say. Professor Becker has written more than 10 books and over 100 professional articles. They include Human Capital, The Economics of Discrimination, The Economic Approach to Human Behavior, The Economics Life, that's the book written with Professor Gidi Nashat Becker, and others. These books have been translated into Chinese, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Russian, Spanish, and other languages. He's now a member of the board of Faster Cures, dedicated to speeding up medical cures, the Advisory Committee on Financial Innovation of the CMAC, and the Hoover Task Forces on Energy and the Financial Crisis. It is really an honor to have Professor Becker here to speak to us, and I'm going to go and sit down and listen raptly to what you have to say. Thank you.
thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here, to be back at Berkeley. Let me thank all of you for attending. In particular, let me thank Ambassador Baxter, who I've known and met at a number of conferences and other occasions, and I'm happy, really honored to be able to participate in this series. I was reflecting on my last time I was at Berkeley, and I can't remember the exact date, but I do remember one occasion, which I'll have to repeat. I was spending a week as a visiting professor at a younger age, and I was sitting in my office, and all of a sudden the door was pushed open, and 3 policemen came in. They didn't say a word. They looked around, saw everything was okay, and walked out. And I'm thinking, well, what's going on here? Well, something had happened, I guess, and they were checking everybody. But it's Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley is one of the great universities of the world. A tremendous faculty, a tremendous student body, graduates like Ambassador Baxter. So it's a really honor for me to be able to participate in this lecture series. Now I'm going to speak about higher education in general. It's a topic that has interested me for a long time. Years ago I wrote a book called Human Capital, which dealt in good measure with investments in education. And it's particularly timely for a number of reasons. Partly, there is an increasing view being voiced in very different quarters that a higher education does not pay, and people are advising people not to go for a higher education. The costs are high, the benefits they claim are low, and they argue the American young people have been fooled into believing that higher education has many benefits, economic, monetary, and other benefits. Now, that view is totally wrong, and I'm going to try to demonstrate that. I'm going to try to demonstrate it in the context of looking at information for a lot of countries, with concentration on the United States, some attention paid to China, but also giving a picture about what's been happening in the world as a whole, very briefly. I'm going to argue, point out the data are very strong. The U.S. has been falling relative to other countries in the numbers of people who are obtaining a higher education. And I think that has negative consequences for our economic and other future. And I'll discuss some of these and also discuss some suggestions about why it's happening and how we might overcome some of the obstacles. So that's the outline of the talk. And let me get into it right away because I have only a limited amount of time. So I'm going to organize my presentation around a bunch of slides that I've prepared for this. So let me see if how well they work. Yeah, here we go. So this is the first slide. It shows us for over 100 countries, using data put together by an institute in Vienna, the fraction of people with a tertiary education of young people, in this case aged 30 to 34, in different countries. Now, it's not easy to compare tertiary education across countries. They've tried to do the best they can. I think they've done a reasonably good job at it. What I've done is break their information up into 3 separate categories. First of all, I looked at the trends over time in the fraction by rich countries versus poor countries. So the top 2 curves are for richer countries, the top half of the countries. The bottom 2 are for poorer countries, and then separated by men and women. And so if you look at first the rich countries up here, here's for men. So sharp increase, and it's pretty flat for 30 years or so. You look at the information for women, they were way behind that of men and young women, and then they overtake them. And I'll come back to that. naturally, in the poor countries, there's an upward trend, but they're lagging significantly behind the richer countries. So that's the pattern that we see, what I call a boom in higher education across countries, rich and poor, especially for women. I think as one summarizes these data, that would be their message. Now, here I look at the United States, 25 to 29, people with at least 4 years of college. And the U.S. shows pretty much the same story. Here's the men, young men, rose sharply, partly here, the Vietnam War, but not only, then came down, and then flattened out. Now, this downturn here, there was a well-known book by an excellent economist written in 1979 called The Overeducated American. The author, Richard Freeman, was at one time at the University of Chicago, my colleague and friend, and he looked at the 70s and said, well, we're overeducating people. And look, fractions are coming down, and data on earnings shows the same thing, and that we have to stop putting so many people through higher education. Well, you'll see that downtrend here was temporary, partly reaction to the excessive numbers in the Vietnam War, people avoiding being drafted. And then they began to take off again and came back up, not that much for men above the earlier time, but for women continued to rise, came down a little bit in the 70s, and then rose, and now it's way above that of men. So that's the picture for the United States. Not too different from that of rich countries in general, but the gap between men and women is sizable, as we'll see now. Here's the next graph. Share of degrees awarded to men versus women, young men again versus young women. And you can see that for bachelor's and master's degrees, 4-year degrees, and for master's degrees, almost 60% of the degrees are going to women. For Ph.D. degrees, it's about half, a little more than half now, but it's really basically about half in professional degrees. So women are clearly dominating in terms of graduating from 4 years of school, of colleges and universities, and also at master's level and increasingly at the doctorate level. All right? That's an interesting fact. Why? I'll try to come back and discuss that a little bit, but not too much, because I've written others out. Now, as a comparison, instead of just dealing with the U.S. and just dealing with countries in general, I singled out China, partly because China is such an important country. I'm interested in China. I haven't done any professional work on China, but I'm interested in a lot of different policies in China. And Didi and I, we visited China first in 1980, where the economy was a mess. And Ambassador, you'll be happy to know that as soon as they brought in some incentive structure, their economy improved a lot. At that time, I visited some factories in China, and they were a mess. Everybody got the same pay, and nobody bothered to come to work. That basically was a story at that time. So that started my interest in China. Here, but now we're talking about education. If we look at tertiary education in China, look what happens. I'm sorry, let's go back. Tertiary education in China, flat here. At that point, here's about when Gidi and I were in China, right around here. College people, educated people, were not earning hardly anything more than anybody else. The earnings schedule was flat. Nobody was going to college, partly because it didn't pay, and partly because this was the end of the Cultural Revolution and colleges were closed and so on. It was a complete mess of higher education in China at that time. Then things began to change. I'll show you a bit later some information on earnings. You see, so it went along pretty flat, and then all of a sudden it's rising like a straight line. This has been the enrollment picture in China since then. Students are clamoring to get a higher education, recognizing that it pays off very well. Again, it's interesting. Women started below men, and enrollments, now you see more women, even in China, are enrolled in higher education been immense. So these are enrollment data. So China is catching up. Now, why the boom in higher education in the world? There are lots of reasons, and I can't say we know exactly all the reasons, or I know at least exactly all the reasons, but here I put down what research has suggested are some of the more important reasons. One, technological progress has favored skilled workers, things like the computer, the internet. Skilled people adopt it more quickly. It's complementary with skills. So that's been really important. Globalization, trade, and growth, FDI, foreign direct investment. That's what you see in China. A lot of the education is partly being motivated because people want to work in good measure in private companies and foreign companies who are investing in China, in which there is a great demand for skilled people, educated people and skilled people. Okay? So that's an important factor, not only in the rich countries, but also in developing countries. Shift toward more skill-intensive sectors like education, health, and so on, service sector in general. Particularly in the advanced countries, but it's also happening in the developing countries. And that raises the demand for more educated people. And the growth in physical capital, including foreign direct investment, because physical capital is what we call in economics is a complement to human capital. That is, in general, an increase in demand, increased supply of physical capital leads to greater demand for more educated people. Now, we can all give examples where physical capital has replaced educated people, and there was once a view that he had more capital, he replaced skilled workers. That isn't true in the modern world. Some skilled workers may get replaced, but on the whole, you increase your demand for skilled workers. And again, that's been really well documented. Now, I've been showing you material on numbers. Well, numbers respond to rewards. Economists study mainly earnings, but also economists, this may be a surprise to the non-economists here, they study things other than earnings. Okay? So when I first started working on human capital, we dealt mainly with earnings. That was an area where we had the most information on. And I'm going to still deal mainly with earnings in my presentation. But we know things, and I'll give you some examples of things about other than earnings, and we'll show that education has a big effect, a positive effect, in almost every dimension of life. Okay, well, let's go to some of the earnings data. Here's for the United States. What we're plotting here is the earnings of people with bachelor's degrees or higher relative to that of high school graduates. And then we're plotting this curve, and you see there was a significant increase, pretty flat here. Richard Freeman's overeducated American period, they're making like 40% more than that of high school graduates. So given a cost that wasn't that great, now it increased. It's roughly 80% more now. So big increase. We're going up to around 2010, not fully through the last present, but you can see there's no big decline in recent years at all. Some college hardly pays off. So the advocacy of a year of college or 2 years of college, well, there you see very little advantage in that. And that shows up in a lot of other data as well, not only on earnings. And you can see there's a lot of discussion of inequality starting around 1980. Well, there was a spreading out of earnings by education starting around 1980, and that was reflected more generally. I have a chart I'm not putting up here on how the earnings of the top 10% compared to the bottom 90%, and that also began to diverge significantly around 1981. So it's partly related to the spread in earnings by education. I think in terms of, you look at the spread in earnings, the increase in earnings inequality, a lot of that is due to the spread in earnings by skill level since 1980, for the reasons I cited earlier, the big increase in demand for more skilled people. So there is a great gain from greater skill and greater education. How far that extends to the really top of the earnings distribution in terms of the hedge fund earnings and so on, that will be an open question. But in terms of most of the earnings distribution, it's a skill premium that's widened a lot in recent years. Now, if we look, here's unemployment. Well, people say, well, the educated people are suffering off from unemployment in this recession. Not true. A myth. They've suffered from unemployment, but so even more so have the less educated people. And here's the bottom is the people with bachelor's degree or higher. You can see, yes, it rose. It rose for educated people pretty high to almost 6%, now down to around 4%. Okay? Now take high school dropouts. Hit 18%, still very high. High school graduates, still pretty high. People with some college, as in the earnings, very similar to that of high school graduates. People with some college have pretty high unemployment rates. So if you look at unemployment, again, people with a college education are doing much better. We had a driver who drove us from Stanford today, and he was asking, well, does college pay? And I'm saying, well, I'm going to speak about that in a moment, and go back and get your 4-year degree. He had a little junior college degree, because it does pay. And on the whole, I mean, not for everybody, these are averages, but on the whole, it pays a lot, and pays very well. And not only in earnings, unemployment, here's a piece of evidence that is not very well known at all, the relationship between education and health. And I use one particular measure of health here, a lot of them you can use. Expected life remaining at age 25 is for the United States by education level, and you see a significant advantage to college degree or higher for both men and women. Women, of course, live longer than men, but the education advantage is not greater for women than for men. And there's been somewhat increase in the premium over that 10-year period, but I wouldn't make too much out of that. This holds for other countries as well. I'm not putting up here, but I have data for, say, Russia. Russia experienced an enormous decline in life expectancy after the end of communism and during the turmoil that followed, and even to this day. It was not true for the more educated people. Theirs were pretty flat. It was mainly concentrated in the less educated people. So the gap is huge in now Russia, but it reflects somewhat similar to what we're seeing here. Now, people might say, well, this is an association between education and earnings and health, but is it a causation? Maybe it's just the better people who get your college education. That's been a problem that's occupied economists and other social scientists for at least 50 years. In my book on human capital, first published in 1964, I already devoted an extensive number of pages to trying to look at that issue. I concluded at the time that, yes, the adjustment for abilities and so on would lower the gain, but most of it survived that. And my reading of literally hundreds of studies looked at that since then have even come out with a stronger view that by far the largest part, some people even say we're underestimating return because of error, some technical econometric issues and errors in the data and the like. And that's also true in this health material. One of my students wrote his doctoral dissertation trying to correct these crude data, which is somewhat similar. This is from the Center for Disease data, but he has some other data. He tried to correct that by using it's called some instruments for education. He found similar effects, that education was causative in terms of health, not only in earnings, but in terms of health. So the view that everybody raises, whenever I speak about education, but is it a causative? I said, yes, it predominantly is causative. Not all of it, but predominantly, and not for everybody, but predominantly causative. Now let's go look at some earnings data. I start out with China. Look at China. Okay, so now think in mind now. We go back to what happened to enrollments. We say, well, what's causing that increase in enrollments? Well, here's an obvious story to explain that increase in enrollments, that college pays off a lot more. These are the earnings in log units of people with college or above. You see, they're not that much above. You go back to this period, the period here. Didi and I were here around here. The gap was even smaller, almost non-existent. Now, small gap still. So it was flat. Now the gap starts increasing. Starts increasing about the same time that you have this enormous increase in enrollment. People are responding to incentives. I mean, there's one thing I feel that is crucial in understanding human behavior is people respond to incentives. They don't all respond the same way, and they make mistakes and all that. All that's true, and that's important for some issues. But they do respond to incentives. You ignore that, you get in a lot of trouble. Here's what's happening to college graduates. Some increase for other groups, senior high school, junior high school, but the gap clearly has widened enormously since then. And despite the great increase in the numbers enrolled that the previous data showed, let me go back to that. Here, number enrolled. Here's China numbers enrolled. Despite this enormous increase, starting in the 90s, despite that, despite that, you have this premium has remained pretty constant. Yes, it's decline. Earnings have declined here, but that's true for all these groups that we're looking at. So the gap has not been narrowed at all. Maybe for younger people, some other evidence shows for younger people entering the Chinese market with education, it's been tougher. But for older people, it's gotten even better. Okay? Now, if we look at the United States, here's the college wage premiums by gender. Before I showed you some data for the United States by gender. Actually, they both have increased. There's no particular evidence that the premium has increased faster for women than for men. They're pretty close. And so, because that raises the question, I've tried to answer with two co-authors in an article we published a couple of years ago. Reference at the bottom here. It's blocked, so I can't show it. But we asked what. Well, it's okay. No, it's okay.
Yeah, if you could move, that would be good.
All right, I'll move it. I got earned my keep here, so let me move that. Are we okay? Yeah. Okay. Becker, Journal Human Capital. So we asked the following question. Why is the earnings of women, why are the fraction of women who obtaining higher education exceeded that of men, and by a lot? And he said, well, can you find it? It's true that women are more likely to be in the labor force. That's true. They participate in the more long-run basis. That's all true. They don't participate more than men. Okay? So if you look at any of the benefit side, yes, the gap should have narrowed, but doesn't suggest that women should be overtaking that of men in higher education. So what's the source of it? It's not on the benefit side. We argue it's on the cost side that women, for one or two reasons, or some combination of these reasons, that women are better students than men on the average. And we have a lot of data in that paper which suggests they are better students on the average. And as a result of that, when the returns improved in the United States, my earlier data show the returns improved a lot from 1980 and so on, women were better situated to take advantage of that. And so let's say this is a schematic illustration. The only graph or only piece of at all economic analysis that I'm directly putting into this talk. Here is a graph of supply and demand, main supply, and here's the demand as measured here by the prices they're getting. Here's was the situation in 1970. Men here, women here, big gap the other way. So at that time, 60% of all the four-year degrees went to men. And now, higher returns, women took advantage of it more than men. 60% are going to women. That's a simple story of, I think, what has been going on over this period, not only in the United States, but in other countries. All right, now, I mentioned in the introduction to my talk the United States is falling behind. That we were leaders in high school education in the first half of the 20th century, and then the leaders in higher education. And we're still significant in higher education, but we are falling behind. Here I'm using the same data that I just presented earlier on the situation for over 100 countries. And then looking at how the U.S. young people ranked relative to other countries and the fraction of people of the higher education. Now, these are only crude estimates. It's very hard to compare the education systems of different countries. So, I mean, this is not to the last decimal point by any means, but I think the trends are accurate. And you can see U.S. ranked very high in 1970, and we're pretty high still in 2010, but we've fallen relatively. And we've fallen for the reasons I showed earlier, that it's been pretty flat for men, and even for women, even though there's been a big increase, it's been increasing for women in other countries as well. And so women have fallen as well as men. Same thing is true for high school, fallen even further. We were quite high in 1970, not quite as high as for tertiary education, and now we're ranked, according to these data, 27th or 28th. Again, the exact numbers aren't, one can quarrel about them because, as I said, it's hard to get internationally comparable data on something even like education. But the trend, I think, is the right one. So the final kind of question I'm addressing is, why has this been happening? Why has the U.S. been falling behind? And then what can we do about it, if we can do anything about it? Here's as good a piece of evidence to start with as why the U.S. is falling behind. This is high school graduation rates, taking out GED, graduate equivalence degree, taking that out because my colleague Jim Heckman has shown it isn't worth anything in terms of what they get in the labor market and so on. So you want to look at people who really graduated high school. You see that's been pretty flat at a very high rate of dropouts. This gives us the graduation rates. So it's been around 80% for whites, and white women are somewhat higher. White males a little bit lower. So women are graduating more. And African American women are lower still, but still and declining in their graduation rates. And then African American men increasing some, but really still very low graduation rates. So we're approximately 20 to 23 or so % of U.S. young people are not finishing high school. Well, they don't finish high school, they're not going on to college typically. And that's the fundamental source, a fundamental source. And you see the same thing in four-year colleges. Here's fraction of college starters who complete 4 years of college. Again, separated by, for young people, men and women. So we start in 1960s. Men were far more likely than women to complete because women often started but dropped out to get married. That was the main reason, important reason for the dropouts. Now look what's happened. Women, some fluctuation, but they've increased pretty significantly, but still pretty good fraction dropout. And for men, really a sharp decline. So from 65% or so here down to under 55, around 55% or so. So even those who are starting college are not finishing 4 years of college. And you say, well, they're getting a couple of years of college. But we showed with other data that a couple of years of college doesn't add much to your health. It doesn't add much to your earnings. It doesn't add much to your employment prospects. It doesn't reduce your unemployment by much. So that isn't much help. So 2 more slides, or 3 more slides, and I'm finished. Okay? Yeah. Here, one of the factors that's important, what's happening to undergraduate tuition and fees broken down by various private 4-year, 2-year, and public. Obviously, private 4-year are the most expensive, so they've risen a lot. These are all in real terms, so they've about doubled. But all of them have increased a lot, but from different levels, and not all of them have doubled, like the public 2-year schools and the like. So tuition has grown a lot, okay? Now, it turns out, if you do the calculations, which I've done, that despite the growth in tuition, the growth in earnings and benefits, in particular earnings, is more than enough to compensate for the growth in tuition. So colleges, I like to say, is a good deal. Even for if you're paying a fair bit in tuition, it's a very good deal. It may be hard to finance that, and I'm going to come back to that issue. But if you can finance it, it's a good deal. The earnings, increase in earnings, have dominated the increase in tuition. Okay. People often don't see that. They say, well, look, tuition is going up so much. Yeah, that may be difficult to finance, and that's an important issue. But if you net it out, if you look at the net benefits, there's no question there's been an increase in the net benefits after the increase in tuition. Okay? Now, high school dropout rate is a tough one. How to improve it? Well, I start out, I've been long interested in the family, improve family stability. Not easy to do. This is a long run. It's something you have to do in the long run. It's really important, I think, in this, but it's not something you can get a short run solution. Here are my suggestions for 4 short run solutions. Introduce choice. Introduce choice. A lot of evidence, mixed. We're still getting more evidence on vouchers and charter schools. My reading of the evidence is that they do improve performance, although not every charter school, and we have only limited voucher programs. Competition does that in general, and there's no reason why education is any different in that regard than any place else. And I think the evidence on the whole suggests it, although one can say, well, the evidence is limited. Differential pay for good teachers. Most school systems pay teachers pretty much the same, yet there's increasing evidence that good teachers pay off. Some recent studies suggest it pays off really enormously. I don't know if they're exaggerating or not, but good teaching pays off. We all know from our own personal experience. I like to say, well, I remember in high school 2 teachers, an English teacher and a math teacher, both I felt had an influence on me. The rest of them are a maze. I don't remember them. But 2 of them really had an influence in very different fields. I think of the university. I went to a good university. Maybe 2 or 3 teachers had an influence on me, who I thought were really good teachers. At graduate school, had Milton Friedman as a teacher, and Baxter in particular will be happy about that. He was one of the greatest teacher I ever had, a great teacher, and a few other really great teachers at Chicago, and some not in economics. But most of them were not. So it's not easy to get good teachers, not easy to find good teachers. Lots of reasons why people want to teach, but pay helps you attract them. It's not the only force. When we say that pay them more, you'll get more, it's not saying that people are only motivated by money. No, they're not. A lot of us wouldn't be teaching at universities if that was our only motivation. But money can help attract people. Okay? Fire bad teachers more easily. Don't let bad teachers hang around and just continue to clutter up a classroom, because they do positive damage. Okay? Now, let me point out that all 3 of these things have been violently, strongly opposed by teachers' unions. They've been a major obstacle in everything. They've opposed voucher and charter schools, continue to do so. They've been strong opponents for merit pay. I had a student when I was at Colombia, that was a long time ago, who did a thesis on merit pay and the union view. And even at that time, they were strongly opposed to merit pay. They've been strongly opposed to having criteria about firing bad teachers, such as teachers whose students don't perform well on tests and so on. So that's been, I think, the biggest obstacle. This has been gradually overcome in charter schools. This has not been overcome yet. This has not been overcome yet. In Chicago, we just had a strike in the Chicago school system because the mayor of Chicago was trying to get better criteria to evaluate teachers. He had a big battle with the teachers union. He mainly backed down. He got a couple of changes. This was Rahm Emanuel. Got a couple of changes he was able to get through. The last one doesn't seem like it's relevant. Decriminalize drugs. Many high school dropouts get involved in the drug trade. Okay, decriminalize drugs, and you will not be a magic solution, but you will solve a bunch of problems. One of them being you'll help get more people, give them incentive to stay in school. Now, rising tuition. Let me repeat, college is still a very good deal despite its expense. College graduates are an elite, and I believe should pay for much of their education. Okay, they're earning more than everybody else on the average. Okay, so they're an elite. Taxpayers are, let's say, average in terms of income. These people are above average, all of us. But make it easier. Still, there is a problem of financing your college education. Not only tuition, but also what we call in economics your foregone earnings. Your earnings you're giving up by being in school rather than being at work. That's a big obstacle for many people because you need to live and so on. Make it easier for college graduates to repay loans. That's a big problem. I don't have a panacea for that, but perhaps go back to a system that's old, make repayments of loan contingent on income. More, they aren't really now, and you can't declare bankruptcy with a college loan. So that if you're earning a lot, you pay back more. If you're earning a little, you pay back less. I mean, there are problems with that and adverse selection and some other issues. But I think we should explore more of that because for many people, the loan burden is becoming a major burden. And we have to think of ways to do that without losing sight of the first two bullet points. College is still a good deal, and college graduates are elite. So that's the challenge, to make the financing easier so that we're not blocking people who are coming out of modest means. I think that's crucial to enable such people to get a higher education. So let me conclude now. These are just a summary of my main points. Worldwide boom in higher education. U.S. has participated in the boom but falling behind. We have high dropout rates from both high school and college. I think we can take steps to lower the dropout rate, and we have to take some steps to improve the ability of students to finance their higher education. And I'll close on the following comments, that the reason we've had this worldwide boom, as I showed earlier, is the modern world is very much knowledge-based, as we all know. People who command knowledge, who know how to get access to additional knowledge. They're at a great advantage relative to everybody else. So that's not going to go away. That's a permanent part of the landscape. By permanent, I mean if we look ahead 20 years or so, that's going to be there, maybe even get more severe. It's a knowledge world. And I can see we have a grandson visiting now who's pretty good with manipulating the internet and his iPhone and so on. I feel how far behind Guy and I are on that. No matter how hard I try to keep up and she tries to keep up, we're getting further behind. So it's a knowledge-based world. And college is not the only way to acquire knowledge, obviously, many other ways, but it's a crucial way to acquire a lot of the knowledge. So it's really crucial. The United States has some real weaknesses, some strengths but real weaknesses, and I think we have to give a lot of thought, not by saying college doesn't pay, it pays a lot, how to get more people to be able to take advantage of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One observation I made. Thank you very much indeed for that stimulating, provocative presentation. So for the students in the audience, the message is pretty clear. Stay in school, graduate, and if you do that, the faculty's employment rate will also stay high, which is a side benefit of that. I'd like now to introduce Professor Enrico Moretti to comment on Professor Becker's talk. Professor Moretti is Professor of Economics at the University of California, Berkeley, right here. He holds the Michael Peavy and Donald Weil Career Development Chair in Labor Economics. He's Director of the Infrastructure and Urbanization Program at the International Growth Center, which is the London School of Economics and Oxford University. He's also a Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge and a Research Fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research in London at the Institute for the Study of Labor in Bonn, Germany. So he has a global reach. His research interests primarily labor economics, urban economics, and applied econometrics. I'm going to mention his new book, The New Geography of Jobs, which is now available. Enrico.
Thank you, Gary, for a very insightful, broad picture analysis of some of the structural issues in the American labor market and educational system, and for a set of insightful suggestions for how to deal with these issues. I must say that I very much agree both with the diagnosis of the problems as well as with the cure proposed for these problems. Let me start with diagnosis. Probably the most important change that we've seen in the U.S. labor market over the past 30 years has been a stark and significant increase in the demand for educated workers and a stark and significant decline in the demand for less educated workers. And that has translated in the vast changes in the wages of these two groups that Gary has shown us. Just to refresh your memory, the wage of an high school graduate in 1980 was 12% higher in real dollars relative to the wage of an high school graduate today. So for the first time in American history, the median worker in the U.S. labor market has actually lost in purchasing power, adjusted salary. By contrast, the wage of a college graduate has increased by 25% since 1980. And the wage of someone with a master's degree has increased by 37%. So, and the causes are the one that I very much agree with Gary's analysis. The causes are globalization, deep changes in the technological landscape that have made one group more productive and the other group less in demand, as well as the type of investment that companies are making today and its complementarity with human capital. The end result is a vast increase in the income distribution, a vast increase in income inequality in the U.S. In the past 2 or 3 years, we've heard a lot about income inequality. And in some sense, a lot of what we heard was generally misplaced. The whole focus on this difference between the 1% and the 99%, in my view, was pushed by the Occupy movement last year, in my view, was misplacing where the problem is. The problem of inequality is not about a few billionaires at the top of the income distribution. It's not about Mark Zuckerberg's salary or Steve Ballmer's salary. The problem of income inequality is the difference not between the 1% and 99%, it's between the 35% with a college degree and the 65% without a college degree. And this is where I think the whole rhetoric of that debate in the past couple of years has been, in my view, misplaced. It doesn't really matter all that much how much Mark Zuckerberg makes. What really matters is how many workers in the U.S. we can bring into the group that has a college degree, whose demand keeps growing and how many workers we can take out of the group high school graduates whose demand keeps shrinking. The other misconception in that debate was that that increase in inequality was purely driven by misguided policies. For example, people have pointed out the decline in minimum wage in real terms, or the decline in unionization. The reality is that, as Gary has shown, that the increase in inequality reflects much deeper and much structural fundamental economic forces that are not easily solved by government fiat, by, for example, raising tomorrow minimum wage. That might help on the margin, but fundamentally, inequality in this country is increasing because the demand for college graduates keeps going up due to technological change and globalization, while the demand for unskilled labor keeps shrinking. And these are not forces that are directly determined by policy. They are deep-seated structural forces that are shifting the technological landscape pretty much everywhere in the world. In fact, income inequality is increasing in blue states and red states pretty much at the same rate. In states that have high minimum wage and states that have low minimum wage. In states where they have more union penetration and states that have less union penetration. So ultimately, this notion that income inequality is driven by explicit deliberate economic policy or failure of economic policy, I think it's missing the main mark, and it's in some sense it's misleading. It would be very easy if we could just raise the minimum wage and fix this problem. But unfortunately, the problem is much deeper. So I completely agree that the fundamental issue that we're facing today is how can we increase the number of college graduates. Where I would add to Gary's analysis, where I would go even further relative to Gary, is that I think that education has a benefit, not just for the individuals that acquire it. So there's clearly a private benefit in terms of higher salaries for those who acquire education, but also for the communities of the people where these highly educated workers live. So in some sense, there is not just a private benefit of education, but there is also an external, a social benefit. Let me give you 3 examples. I think probably the clearest one is crime. There is growing body of evidence that suggests that if you increase education, you lower the probability that individuals engage in crime, and therefore you lower this important negative externality. That's clearly something that it's an external benefit of education that benefits not just those who acquire education, but also people in the community. Health. Gary has pointed out that educated individuals are healthier, and this is clearly a private benefit for them. There's a work that I've done and other people have done that suggests that it's not just that educated people are healthier, but also their children are healthier. And therefore, that means healthier next generation and lower costs for everybody else. Third, there are growing body of evidence that point to productivity increases in communities that have a high density of highly educated workers. So, for example, cities where the stock of college graduates is larger because there is more college graduates in the labor force, places like here, for example, or Seattle, or Austin, or Boston. In those places, workers tend to be more productive. And this is true both for the college graduates, but also for the high school graduates. So high school graduates in cities like here tend to be more productive than observationally equivalent high school graduates in cities with lower level of aggregate education. That's potentially another benefit that education has, not just for the individual, but also for the communities around it. Just to give you an example, if you look at the 1980, a city like Austin and a city like Flint had a similar share of college graduates and similar wages for high school graduates. Today, Austin has almost twice as many college graduates per capita than Flint, and the wage of high school graduates in Flint is 60% higher. I'm sorry, the wage of high school graduates in Austin is 60% higher than the wage of high school graduate in Flint. And it's not like the workers in Austin are working longer hours or are just smarter. It's just that the entire local ecosystem is more productive, and this is benefiting the both the college graduates and the high school graduates. So the bottom line is education does wonderful things for us as individuals, as a tremendous private return, higher earnings, better health, and so on, and also a social return that I think should be added to the calculation when we're thinking about the overall benefit of education. So then why are Americans not going more to college? What's stopping us? And if you read the New York Times or if you follow the media, you get the impression that the problem is student loans or the problem is tuition. And again, I agree very much with Gary that this is a very misleading message that we're sending to our young people. In 40 years ago, Gary wrote a book called Human Capital, where he made this point, where education, where it showed that education is just like any other investment, where you pay an upfront cost and you reap benefit later. Right? So people have done the calculation of what's the return on this investment. Well, if you sum the salary of a college graduate over its life cycle and you discount it back to a fixed year, that amounts to $1 million in life cycle earnings. If you sum the earnings of an high school graduate, that amounts to $500,000. So the benefit of this investment is the difference between these two. It's $500,000. The cost of this investment is the tuition cost and the foregone earnings for the 4 year of college. And that, for the average college, that's about $120,000. So this is an investment where if you can pay $120,000 up front, you can make $500,000. Well, there's no other better investment than this investment. People have compared this with the stock market return, real estate return, investment in any other asset you can think of. This is the best investment, the investment at the highest return you can that exists around. It's also one of the investments that has the lowest risk. Then the question is, so this obsession that the media and especially the New York Times have on people should not go into college because it's too costly, or people are drowning in student loans. It's clearly misguided because it's ignoring the fact that for the average student this is clearly a great investment. Then the question is, if it's not that, what should we do? If it's not just the pure increase in tuition, what should we do? Gary proposes three solutions. One is family, strengthen the family. One is reform high schools. The idea being that by increasing high school graduation rate, we're going to increase the flow of people who are eligible to enter college. And the third one is liberalize drugs. Well, on drugs, I think there's a lot of reason to liberalize drugs. I think that of the three, it seems to me the most tenuous, of the most indirect of the reason. I don't see it, and my prior would be that liberalizing drug would not significantly increase the number of college graduates in the U.S. But I'm all in favor of it, but for different reasons. On family, I completely agree. That's probably the reform that's probably the change that would have the strongest impact in the long run. But again, as he pointed out, this is not going to, we're talking about changing social norms. We're talking about changing attitudes. So this is not going to occur, if at all, next year. And it's really hard to see how government could play a role. I mean, I'm not an expert, but it seems a worthwhile goal, but something that is very ambitious. I completely agree on high school reform. I think the growing body of evidence points to the fact that giving choice to people and giving incentives to teachers seems fairly basic. We apply to pretty much any other industry. I really don't see any reason why, beside pure lobbying on the part of the union, why we shouldn't do it. Let me add one suggestion that I think Gary hasn't brought up, but I think it would, at very low cost for taxpayer, would vastly increase the number of college graduates in this country. And it has to do with immigration reform. We are in a country where immigration basically puts absolutely, the immigration system puts absolutely no weight on skills. In fact, it implicitly penalizes skills. I think an immigration reform that shifts the immigration system from a system that is neutral or penalizes skills to a system that is strongly based on skills would vastly increase the supply of college graduates, the number of college graduates in this country. And I think it would have tremendous benefits. One, because it would, holding constant the number of immigrants. So I'm talking about shifting the mix of immigrants. I think the main benefit would be that the low-skilled workers who have been so hard hit by this deep-seated long-run trends in labor demand would definitely benefit from an increase in the number of college graduates. Certainly without shrinking the gap in earnings between the college graduates and the less educated of Americans. It would be a way to reduce income inequality at very little cost for taxpayer money. I think countries like Canada and Australia already have a system like this. That if you have a master or a college, you get a visa no matter what tomorrow. And it makes no sense that the U.S., where a lot of these people would like to move instead of Canada or Australia, actually tries to do everything in their power to keep them away. But I think this could actually benefit not just the high school graduates who see an increase in their relative wages, but potentially it could also benefit the entire U.S. economy by fostering, by helping innovative companies, helping companies, especially in the high-tech sector, especially in places like this, and by increasing the overall level of investment in new technology and strengthening the position of the U.S. as a leader in innovation. Now, of course, it's not the same. Like if you educate our American-born children, it's not the same as importing already educated, college-educated Indians or Chinese. It has profoundly different implication. In one case, the good jobs that Gary was talking about in innovation, in knowledge production, would go to American native children. In the other case, they would go to Indian-educated or Chinese-educated workers. That said, I think it would still be in the self-interest of the U.S. to vastly reform immigration. And I think we're seeing some very awful signs in the current immigration debate. In particular, there's a bipartisan piece of legislation that suggests a reform along this line. But overall, I thought that was a very insightful lecture. As economists, we spend our time, we labor on very technical and narrow questions all the time. And what we do, it mostly ends up in very dry academic papers that a handful of other economists read, but not many other people read. And I think there is a tremendous role for lectures like this, where we step back and we look at the big picture and we try to take stock and see where we should go from here. So thank you, Gary, for all these insights.
A couple of minutes. Yeah, just briefly, I thought, Enrico, you very good comments. I agree with, he's agreeing with me a lot. I'm agreeing with him again. A couple of points, and I'm going to be brief because I'd like to get to questions on. I just came from a meeting on immigration reform with former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who's head of a commission now on immigration reform. And I had recently written something on selling the right to immigrate as a way to, it would be a general sale, not just for special people, with like a student loan program to help people immigrate, which we would get a lot of skilled people in. But that said, I think we also have to meet the issue, how do we get more people from this country getting a higher education. Immigration reform is great. I support it completely. But I don't think that solves the problem of getting more Americans to get a higher education. So I think that's still an important issue. And the other issue is social benefits have been a controversial and important part of the literature on education for a long time. And certainly, even in my book on human capital, I devoted a chapter or so to it, with an unsatisfactory outcome. It's very hard to measure. I mean, there's no question that crime is an important social benefit. Health, well, yeah, because the government is paying for a lot of health, you might say so, but that's the government pays for a lot of things, so we can get a lot of things, social benefits. When we think of that, you got to really separate that. On the productivity effects, those are trickier, much trickier to mention. You've worked on this problem. They're very hard to measure. I'm sympathetic with the idea that they're there, but I still think there's an open research question how important they are. But for that said, I'd like his comments. I thought he had some good insights, and I think I'd like to get to the questions. Let's hear what people are asking.
I'll just read the questions, and then both of you, please. Start with the first question, is why does higher education have a better return for women than men?
Well, I tried to answer that a bit. I mean, that's still a research question that people are addressing. Our take on it has been that and this, in a sense, isn't answering the question. In a sense, it's answering the question, but there's always, when you answer any research question, there's always a deeper question you could be asking. And so what research does is peel back problems and getting to more and more basic. And that's my take on why women are getting more educated. They're getting a higher return in a sense that they're better students. They don't drop out of college as much. They don't drop out of high school as much. Their grades are better, and so on. So given that, it's easy to explain why they are more likely to get a higher education. Now, why that is true, why young boys are much more delinquent problems and so on, much more troublesome in class and so on. I mean, I don't have any deep answer to that, and there's a lot of literature on that among psychologists and biologists and so on. So I think that's the question. As I see the frontier area of research on that question, that's the question I think we have to ask now. I mean, the facts are clear. The reasons for the facts at one level are clear, but the deeper reasons for these facts are clear. And the only thing I would add on that is when I've spoken about women versus men, people say, well, the United States education system feminizes boys. They don't like it. The problem for that interpretation, I mean, I'm willing to take every interpretation and think about it, is this is a worldwide phenomenon. So any explanation that's specific to the United States educational system can't be right. It has to be something that's much more general. That's true in China. It's true in even Iran, my wife's country. More women are enrolled in higher education in Iran, a mullah-dominated country. Nevertheless, that's a fact. So there's something basic going on here. And I've given you what I see as some of the reasons. There's still more basic reasons behind those reasons. But it's not something unique to the United States educational system. That's something the facts are clear about.
Let me try this. This next question is a question about your view of one of the reforms that you would be interested in support, or what do you think of the emphasis now on online learning and these giant, what do they call MOOCs? Would this reduce the cost and increase access? Do you favor that kind of reform?
Well, I think online learning has great potential. The only entrepreneurial activity I was ever involved in, I helped found, along with a good friend of mine who was more important in it, an online learning company in the 90s. We raised a ton of money. over $150 million. The company went under, finally. We didn't have a very good business model, I'm afraid. So anybody who thinks it's easy to make money in business, that experience is not easy to make money in business. It's very competitive. But nevertheless, even though that company failed, I think online learning has great potential, and we haven't really scratched the surface of that potential. How to use it effectively? I mean, yes, you can have a star lecturer have 150,000 students, and that's useful, and people in China and all over the world will watch it. And I'm thinking of trying to give one of these big courses online. But in terms of meeting the general educational needs of people, I think we have to harness it more effectively than we've yet been able to do, to giving people instruction, the feedback, and so on. Give them a feeling of interaction with not only with the teacher, with fellow students. Companies are doing that. We tried to do that, and companies are doing that. So I think that is going to be perfected. I think it's going to be a major competitor for physical, plan-oriented education. Will it replace it? I think the third and fourth, and maybe even the second-tier college and university, I think it's going to be an enormously good substitute for that type of education. It will replace some of that. For the top tier, the Berkeleys and so on of the world, I'll put the University of Chicago in that. It's going to be much tougher to replace it. But even the top universities can more effectively use online education, interacting with physical. That's the direction I think it's going to go.
I agree. My first reaction as a labor economist is to think about the labor market for professors in 20 years if this thing takes off. I don't know whether it will. I generally agree with Gary on how it could play out. I don't see Berkeley professor being out of business anytime soon. But imagine what the labor market for chamber musicians was when they invented the gramophone. And instead of having 30,000 chamber musicians, all you needed was 3 that were extremely good. Those 3 were very, very happy because they made millions by selling their discs. But all the other ones didn't have a job. And presumably that was very good for consumers. For the type of teachers and professors in the type of second or third tier or fourth tier university, this is going to be a vast shift, negative shift in the labor demand for the skills if this takes off.
Let me add one thing to what Inka was saying. If you look at the earnings distribution among higher education, among professors and so on, it's pretty contracted. There are some so-called star professors who earn more than others, but relative to a lot of fields, it's a narrow distribution. I think along the lines of what you're saying is we may get a phenomenon where a relatively small number of so-called superstar teachers or researchers and so on will be earning a lot more. So that will be an inequality creating force in terms at that level, but it will certainly provide greater access to education for a lot of people.
Here's a question on signaling, and it starts out like this. Another Nobel Prize winner, Michael Spence, argued that higher education is a signal of ability and not only a cause of higher productivity. Where does signaling fit in your understand of the contribution of education?
Well, signaling is a very interesting theory. It's been around a long time. As Spence wrote this work in over 30 years ago, maybe almost 40 years ago. And there's no doubt there are some signaling elements in education and other sorts of activity. So there are a lot of signals we give off in a lot of parts of life, not only where we went to school or where we live, who our friends are, and so on. They all have signaling effects. The real question is signaling a major determinant of the payoff to higher education, or is it a factor, a really small factor? If you think of fields, people will say, well, yes, this doesn't apply to engineering, it doesn't apply to physics. it doesn't. Let's say if you're in finance, you learn the Black-Scholes model for measuring derivatives. Oh yeah, you're learning something there. They say, but however, when you look at other fields like humanities or economics, it's all signals. I think that's totally wrong. And you say, and so there are two responses. What does the empirical evidence say? Well, it's very difficult to get empirical evidence on this question, but it is possible to do work by looking at either piecework activities and how well people perform different pieces, look at different regions of a country and so on, where you have a increase in education because you change the age of enrollments and so on, or we call exogenous increases. You try to get it that way. All this evidence, as my reading of it, suggests that signaling is far from the major factor in it. And in terms of thinking about it theoretically, well, I like to think about things theoretically as well as look at data. You think about it theoretically, what are people getting out of higher education aside from learning engineering skills or biology and so on? Well, one of the things you're getting is knowing how to acquire knowledge. And I said there's a knowledge-based economy. We're a knowledge-based economy. The ability not only to learn knowledge, but know how to acquire additional knowledge is something along with the knowledge we get at universities and colleges, is something we acquire at colleges that is extremely valuable, especially in the modern world, the modern economy. So I think both on theoretical grounds, and there are more technical theoretical grounds I'm not going to go into, and on empirical grounds, my conclusion has been that signaling is there, but it's a really small part of the returns to higher education. And we have not been misled. Signaling theory would say that the world has gone down, public policy has gone down a dead end, and is going down an increasingly bad dead end because we do not understand there's no basic return to education. That's putting it in extreme form. I mean, in extreme form, that's what is said. There's no return to education, basically. It's only a return to ability. And education is just a measure of your underlying ability, but it's not contributing anything. Well, I don't believe the world has gone down this path. I don't think China is hastily expanding the number of universities at almost exponential rate because they do not understand that there's no basic return to education. I think they do understand there's a basic return, as we do understand it here, and that while there is signaling, is not the dominant source of the return.
Let me, there's so many questions, I'll try and sort of synthesize a couple together, but this one I'm going to put in the frame that both of you argued that one of the remedies would be more competition, rewarding teachers who have merit and getting rid of those that are not competent. So I'm going to read this card. It says, competition, is the faculty tenure system based on outdated ideas?
I agree.
I mean, it seems inconsistent with...
Yeah, if it was up to me, I'll be gladly get rid of it. I don't see it. I mean, there's the intellectual argument for, it allows you to take on more riskier projects, possibly, but I would say by and large the costs are larger than the benefit, in the sense that there is some people who might probably, given the right incentives, might be more productive, might put more effort in research and teaching if they didn't have tenure. I think this might be particularly salient for maybe not a very super top school like here, where people are still working long hours and decades after getting tenure. But maybe at a lower level, I don't really see in a teaching college. I'm not sure I see a lot of value for tenure.
Yeah, let me make a comment. I had a very good friend who unfortunately passed away recently, an economist, Armin Alchian, and I remember when he got tenure, he said he's giving a going out of business party. He was at UCLA. It took him a long time, much too long. That's a sign of a judgment of his colleagues to get tenure because he was really a very creative economist. I think tenure was an important system, and is an important system in a society where universities are limited in number and controlled by the state. Because then you worry if you speak up against the state and the state is controlling it, and it's not decentralized the way the Cal system is, where you have boards and so on. It's not running things, but you really have people making appointments, like in Iran now, where the government makes appointments at universities. Then tenure is valuable. It gives people some protection against that. The United States, however, is a highly competitive higher education system. And so the traditional arguments for tenure are much weaker in this context than they are in the other contexts. That said, I think if we abolish tenure, we wouldn't have an enormous change. Because you look at companies. In most companies who manage to stay in business, once you've been there a few years, you have de facto tenure. The turnover rates, you've studied labor markets, I've studied labor markets. Turnover rates are very high for young people. They decline substantially for older people, and they turn over, the company goes out of business, and so on. So I don't think it would make an enormous difference, but I generally have opposed tenure for a long time. I think in the U.S. context, it's not desirable to have it. In other countries, I would say, yes, tenure is an important protection of people so that they have the right to criticize and so on, and they can't just be arbitrarily fired because there's a monopoly in power. We have competition. That's not only useful in high schools, it's also useful to higher education. That's the reason why we have the strongest system of higher education in the world, because it's such a competitive system. None of us likes it when they're poaching our faculty or we can't get our students, but it's great, and it does provide a great deal of protection for professors in being able to give independent thought and criticisms of either the political system or current ideas in the field.
So I'm going to try and just ask two more questions by combining a lot here. And there's one question which essentially asks, one set of questions that says, you've shown that the return on investment in education is high. Rational actors would therefore invest. But also there's this argument about social benefits and positive externalities. So if it's a good investment, who should be making the investment? Should the federal government have a role in making this investment? Should the private market make an investment, or should it all simply fall on the individual student and her family?
Well, I'll start off, and you can correct me on what I'm going to say. I think mainly the burden should fall on the individual, not all of it. I'll give a couple of reasons why I say not all of it. Why is it mainly? Yes, there are some external benefits, although I said earlier the magnitudes, we can still argue about, but there are definitely some social benefits or what we call external benefits. But the individuals gain a lot. And so since they're gaining a lot, I always found it strange. You want to run a society where you're taxing somebody who's a high school graduate and he's helping pay for the people who are college graduates. Now, to some extent, he may get it. The high school graduates all may get it back because of external effects, but overall, they won't get it all back. The college graduate is going to get it back. He's going to collect most of it. How much? That we can argue. On the other hand, there's always been an important role for government in the educational process. That's the way I would look at it. And at the K-12 level, even if those of us who support vouchers say, well, these, at least for the low-income people, maybe for everybody, the government should be providing the funding for the vouchers. So there is an important role, major role for government. public or private education. At higher education, Berkeley is a state-supported school, although more and more becoming privately supported because of resources. And now Berkeley will have to work harder to raise private money. I don't think that's a bad idea to have to do it. But even at the higher education level, there's an important role. This gets into a little bit of a technical issue. Human capital. Usually, if I buy a house, I give my house as collateral. I borrow on the basis of that collateral. Okay. I invest in my education. I can't give myself as collateral. Okay. And in some societies, you could do that. You can't in modern society, and that's for the good. We can't give ourselves as collateral. Okay. So how do we get people to lend us money? It's virtually impossible to get commercial loans. And so you've never had any extensive system of commercial loans with no public subsidy financing investments in human capital. There have been limited systems like that for doctors and so on, but none. So you need the federal government, I think, or some government. It could be state government. I didn't mean to say federal government. You need a government in some role. In the student loan program, government plays a major role in insuring loans and so on. I think that is a significant role for the government. How exactly it should be structured, I think it's still to be worked out. I don't think we have the optimal structure. But there is a significant role at that level. To the extent there are external benefits, there's a significant role for subsidies. So you encourage people because they're benefiting everybody else. But so there is a significant role for the public sector in education at all levels of education. On the other hand, when we come particularly to higher education, when the benefits are so clear and strong, I think the real challenge is, why aren't people taking advantage of these benefits? Why are people dropping out of high school when it's condemning them to a terrible existence? There's nothing worse in the United States in every dimension of life, on the average, and this is all averages, than being a high school dropout. You earn low, you have high unemployment rates, you can't marry easily, you get kicked out by your spouse if you are married, so your marriages are unstable, your health is bad, your consumption decisions are bad. That's a terrible life to be in. And why are people dropping out when they're condemning themselves to a terrible existence? That's the social, that's the economic challenge. I don't know if we understand it fully. I mentioned 4 or 5 factors. Enrico mentioned some factors. There are some factors there, that some that we can control. I think we have to take action to control it and give people better incentives, better education, so they are more aware of what they're missing, because they are missing an enormous amount if they don't complete high school. That's just the story of the modern U.S. If you drop out of high school, that 90% of people who drop out of high school are going to have a terrible existence in pretty much every dimension of their life.
So the question is, what's the proper role of government in education?
That's one way, yeah.
And economists have always think about thinking about whether government should intervene in the market. They always think about either justifying government intervention either through because of equity consideration or because of efficiency consideration. So as far as equity consideration, I agree with Gary. It's probably not in a system where a cashier at the supermarket or a waiter who doesn't have a college education pays for the college education of someone who then will end up making 70, 80, 90% more than him or her is not a very fair system. There's a big literature on whether expenditures for college are regressive or progressive, and by and large, the funding depends on the state, but by and large, they point to some regressivity in this subsidy. It's effectively people who pay taxes with low income that support the education of people that will become much richer than them. So from the equity point of view, it's not clear. From the efficiency, it's not a great idea. From the efficiency point of view, it really boils down to how much do we think the social return to education exceed the private return to education. So how important are these externalities, the benefit that are not captured by an individual in its own private return. And I personally think that those can be substantial on a number of fronts. By the way, even Milton Friedman in his Capitalism and Freedom had a chapter arguing in favor of public subsidy for education on the ground that by educating citizens, you make them better voters and therefore better decision maker at the poll. And this is
I don't know if you stay with that view. And
later. Yeah.
Well, I think that I'm just going to stop by just reading this somewhat of a rhetorical question. It says, I'm seeking a graduate degree in philosophy. Will it economically pay off? Perhaps Professor Searle can answer that question. But I think the answer from Professor Becker would be yes, because you'll learn something even in philosophy. And on that note, thank you very, very much.